Welcome to the Animal Law Symposium. This year's event will explore the challenges and opportunities inherent to our pursuit of legal protections for wild animals. We're so excited to be joined by scientists, community leaders, and animal law experts to discuss aquatic life, the intersection of wildlife and human populations, the importance of international wildlife treaties, and what the future holds for wild protections in the United States. Wild animals are living beings and experience pain and pleasure the same as all other animals, yet have far less expansive legal protections than other species. Wild animals also play a key role in our environment and ecosystem. The Animal Legal Defense Fund is dedicated to pursuing better legal protections for wildlife. We work to protect wild animals, including those in captivity, by strategically aligning our legislative and litigation efforts to end exploitative practices of using captive wildlife in entertainment, increase wild animals protections and combat attempts to reduce existing protections, advance legislation to protect wildlife and animals in captivity, and enhance enforcement and increase prosecution of wildlife cruelty cases. Today, we will kick things off with what is sure to be a thought-provoking discussion about the often overlooked issues surrounding aquatic wildlife. We are honored to be joined by co-authors of the first textbook on aquatic animal law. Executive Director of Animal Law Reform South Africa, Amy P. Wilson, and the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School's Animal Law Clinic, Director Kathy Hessler. Enjoy.
Thank you, Kathleen. Welcome to the Emergence of Aquatic Animal Law session at the Animal Legal Defense Fund's Virtual Animal Law Symposium. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Amy P. Wilson, and I am the Executive Director of Animal Law Reform South Africa. Now I'd like to introduce Professor Kathy Hessler. Kathy is a clinical professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School. She is the director of the Animal Law Clinic and the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative. She is the faculty advisor for both the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund and Animal Law Review at Lewis and Clark. Professor Hessler co-authored the books Animal Law in a Nutshell and Animal Law, New Perspectives on Teaching Traditional Law. She is currently working on a new book entitled Aquatic Animal Law, Policy, and Science. Now it's time to pass things over to Professor Kathy Hessler for a brief overview of aquatic animal law. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to talk very briefly. We decided to design the session today in a more open way because we know that a lot of people are unfamiliar with aquatic animals. So we wanted to have more time for conversation and have it be led by the perspectives you're all coming from. So that's our design for today. I want to start the conversation, as I always do, by acknowledging I'm speaking from Portland, Oregon, and we feel it's important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place, and at Lewis and Clark in particular, that we honor a number of people upon whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand, including the Multnomah, Clackamas, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. And we can learn much about respectful relationships with animals and the planet from these historical and present day communities. I'm going to do, as I said, a really large sort of meta overview. So I usually, when I'm talking about those things, start with aquatic animals as property. As you know, all animals are considered property right now, generally speaking. That is a contested status and it's an evolving status. So there are some nuances to that we can talk about if folks are interested in. But just taking that as our starting point, animals are deemed owned or managed by individuals, corporations, or by governments. But ownership does not always require what we might consider responsible care. Owners have the ability to regulate all facets of the animal's lives, but are not required to protect them from many kinds of harm. And animals are not seen as self-owning. We have these similar problems in other areas of the law. And again, we could talk about that if folks are interested. But most importantly, animals are seen as plentiful and renewable, as a sustainable resource designed for us to use. And in fact, only valuable in their use for humans. And so that's something that we need to evolve and change. And aquatic animals in particular have this property status problem, but invisibility is a really big problem for them. We literally don't see most of these animals in our day-to-day lives, and that lack of interaction with them results in a lack of understanding, a lack of empathy. We also don't know how many they are, what they do, what they're like, and their numbers are uncountable. And so we come back to this idea of treating them as an unlimited resource, that there are so many of them, we don't have to worry about killing or using many, many millions of them. And we continue to discount the value of them as individuals. We talk about fish as a group, for instance, rather than fishes as individuals. So there's a significant need for legal protection and regulating the use and abuse of these animals so that we can begin to, and because we may begin to, see these animals as valuable in and of themselves. The good news is that alternatives to the use of these animals are possible. Many exist right now, and they're growing very, very rapidly for our uses of these animals in terms of food, research, entertainment, medicine, jewelry, and more. So let's talk about the aquatic animals for just a minute. When we're talking about these animals, most folks don't even know which animals we're talking about. So I've mentioned finfishes. Obviously, on this slide are a lot of other types of animals. So the amphibians, echinoderms, mollusks, cephalopods, crustaceans, reptiles. Some folks are somewhat familiar with them. Most people know a lot about marine mammals, but Cnidaria, the corals, porifera, the sponges, thinking about aquatic birds, insects, and spiders, these are not animals people typically think of. And I'll just mention corals in particular, that most people don't even think of corals as animals, as groups of animals, rather than thinking of them as these sort of rock formations upon which groups of animals may feed or nest. And so if we don't know who the animals are, we're going to have a really difficult time thinking about what the appropriate regulations are. We're not even going to be including them in the conversations we need to be having. So part of this is lifting them up so that we can see them. And so once we know who they are, we can then pay attention to how they're being used. So they're being used in all the same ways every other type of animal is being used. As companions for food and fiber, that we use their skins and fur. We use them for entertainment. We use them as work animals in research and education, as medicine, for beauty and culture products, as decorations. We determine that they are pests, and we deem them as wildlife. So they fit into all the kind of categories that we currently use when we talk about animals, but we typically don't know that they're there. We typically don't see them there. And so part of this conversation is making that more visible. And so why does that matter, and why should we care? Well, they should be mattering for themselves, for their own sakes. They clearly also matter for species survival, and that is a conversation that people are somewhat used to and comfortable having. And for the environment, if we don't have healthy species of animals within the oceans, lakes, rivers, streams, then we're not going to have healthy aquatic habitats, which are really important for us as well, for the environment, for its own sake, and for us to be healthy as well. So lots of reasons to care about these animals. Very, very quickly, talking about legislation. As most folks know, animals aren't well protected in legislation, but even the laws that we have that we may critique heavily for not being sufficiently protective of animals, like the Animal Welfare Act, the Humane Methods of Livestock Slaughter Act, the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the 28-hour transport law, these laws exclude aquatic animals, sometimes outright, sometimes they don't even include them in the term definition of animal. The Animal Welfare Act, for instance, excludes, as we know, all animals used for food or fiber, but it also excludes all invertebrates. So it includes marine mammals, but they wouldn't be protected in terms of food production, for instance. So there's a lot of sometimes double exclusions within a law that mean that these animals get no protection. There aren't protections for breeding. There are protections for endangered species, but not obviously for farmed aquatic animals. And there are a lot on the environmental side of very specific protections for turtles, for dolphins, for sharks, for all kinds of other specific species or specific habitats. And we can talk about that. Within the anti-cruelty laws in the United States, some states, only some states, include aquatic animals within the scope of the protection. And many of those states then go ahead and exempt animals if they're being used for farming, research, hunting, or fishing. Aquaculture which is one of the largest uses of aquatic animals, is not yet widely regulated within the United States, really, or anywhere else. And so we can talk about that if folks are interested. Something to be thinking about when we're talking about aquatic animals, we're talking about water habitats, and both in the US and around the world, that implicates tribal rights, tribal sovereignty, tribal jurisdiction, and traditions. So for Indigenous and tribal peoples, we should be thinking about our work in terms of collaborating with them, understanding their perspectives, respecting their treaties, and having conversations, developing more relationships and collaborative working. We should also be mindful not to treat Indigenous and tribal peoples as sort of monolithic or uniform. In this space, there are lots of different perspectives within the Indigenous and tribal communities. Some people are engaging in fishing and aquaculture, and some people are pushing against those things. So there's no one way to talk about tribal perspectives. There are some really interesting things happening both at the international level and in the US within the tribal perspective that we can talk about if folks are interested in. But I am pleased to say people are beginning to pay more attention. So one of the reasons aquatic animals don't get their due is a lot of people were taught that they're not sentient. They don't feel, they're stupid animals, and they don't really count in our consideration. But they do feel, they can feel pain. This is just a lovely title. There's a scientific consensus that finfish feel pain. There's a scientific consensus that some other aquatic animals are self-aware or have some other cognitive or psychological or biological capacities that we need to be paying attention to. The increasing number of scientific studies showing scientists is helpful for our conversations. I'll note very quickly, I'm talking a little bit about sentience here, but I also want to say it shouldn't be the only marker or only reason that we protect animals. Even when we don't have proof that they're sentient, I would argue we need to be protecting and recognizing them. But this science is expanding and having some impact on the legal realm, which it well should. So in the UK, now all decapod crustaceans and cephalopod mollusks are included in their newly adopted and amended, I should say, anti-cruelty law. So these things are happening around the world. In Spain and Canada, lots of countries have recognized sentience even in their constitutions or in their sort of federal statutory frameworks, some at the lower level, including where we are here in Oregon. And studies are beginning to focus on ocean aquaculture settings and even on the welfare of wild-caught fish. So we can talk about that more. So we need to be accepting the science. We need to be looking for it, using it, figuring out what to do with it, noting that these animals can suffer, noting that some of them are conscious, have been proven to be conscious. And therefore, I think using the precautionary principle when considering uses of these animals. So if we think we might be causing harm, we really ought to look at the science. If we think that's a potential, we ought to maybe rethink those kinds of uses. And so I think we have enough data that we should actually shift our default to saying all animals have some sentience. And so until they're proven opposite, until someone proves that they don't, but that's not where we are right now. So this sentience should affect our legal decision-making. I think it should result in us saying that there's a duty not to cause unnecessary harm and suffering, which we sort of typically understand to be the standing viewpoint, if you will, when we're talking about things like anti-cruelty. And so if we say, well, let's just assume all the animals have sentience, they should all be protected from unnecessary harm and suffering, then we talk about what is unnecessary, what is actual harm and suffering. And I think we also need to take the science seriously, which would lead us to require using alternatives when they exist and take upon ourselves the duty to develop alternatives, non-animal options to the things we want to do. So we can talk about more of that later. So reframing the laws, I think we should stop seeing these animals and the natural world primarily as resources for human use. And just one example of that, we tend to begin to worry about the impact that fishing and aquaculture are having, but we need to recognize the combined impacts of all the uses of the natural world. And so these are not the only exploitative and extractive uses. And so if we're only looking at the harms in isolation of these things and not combined with oil and gas drilling and shipping and all kinds of other things, we are missing the cumulative harms on these aquatic species, populations, and habitats. So we need to assess the sustainability and harm conversation within the context of these other uses and degradations. We should consider the needs of these animals themselves in any sustainability or any legal analysis for themselves, the individual animals, and for their species. So that's a very quick overview to frame some of the conversation we're hoping to have today. Thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the presentation, Kathy. It was very interesting. So we're now going to move to the Q&A portion of the session. So kicking us off, you spoke in your presentation about the lack of explicit legal protections for aquatic animals. And given this kind of reality and that we're all interested in animal law, could you talk a bit about some of the creative ways that animal lawyers or advocates or even other groups are using to protect these animals?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So I'm going to split the answer into sort of two categories. One is, how do we use our existing laws to include these animals as animals? And the other is, what kind of laws can we use sort of regardless? And so to the first point, I think it's our job to look very carefully at these statutes and decide, are animals who are not mentioned excluded? Or are they not? Or is it vague, right? Can we make arguments in some of these places that aquatic animals actually are included in the laws that we already have because they're not explicitly excluded, even if maybe that wasn't the legislative intent, right? So I think we have to grapple with the current statutes we have and contest them a little bit more and see if we can make room for coverage for aquatic animals without having to do new legislative work. So I think that's one thing that we can begin to do. And we can certainly highlight, we can begin to catalog the places in which we think they are excluded so that we can work on inclusion in whichever way we need to do that, through legislative work or through other kind, even sometimes judicial work, right? And then the other thing that we can do is look at just generally the laws that we have. And this is typically what we do as animal lawyers. We don't have as many laws as we'd like to protect animals. And so we use environmental laws, we use zoning laws. And so it's the same thing for aquatic animals. Some of the laws that have been used pretty effectively more recently have been labeling laws. So when folks are saying in the aquaculture or in the fishing context that this is a wild caught, or this is from Maine, or this animal is a particular kind of animal, and it's just simply not true, there are lawsuits that are beginning to get traction on those kinds of things because it's not true. And so that's a little bit different than puffery, right? We actually have some stronger arguments to make when someone says this animal came from Maine and it's not true, as opposed to saying this is a natural animal, right? That's a more problematic kind of a lawsuit to bring. Another area in which laws are used to protect the animals, and again, this is primarily in the fishing and aquaculture setting, is environmental laws. So the environmental damage from both wild-caught fishing operations and aquaculture operations is beginning to be more well understood. And these facilities tend to operate without environmental permits, without NEPA analysis, right? Without looking at the Clean Water Act in the US, without looking at endangered species impacts, without looking at all kinds of things. And so beginning to look at those things, beginning to use those laws and say, you can't add these more exploitative and degradation kinds of uses of these animals on top of these other situations, at least not without some review, some analysis of looking at what kind of harm will result and how that harm can be mitigated. So those are just a couple of examples of the kinds of things we do, which is kind of, doing what we already do. But for aquatic animals, is seeing where they're missing and asking ourselves specifically how we can progress to help them.
Great, thank you. So we're getting a lot of very interesting questions. So I'm going to start with a topic that I think a lot of people are aware of, specifically for aquatic animals. From James, he said, thank you, Kathy and Amy. Has there been any progress on the international law front in protecting sharks from the practice of finning?
There has indeed. So there are both domestic foreign laws, meaning, the laws of other countries are reducing or banning the act of shark finning, including in the US. In the US, we are doing it at sort of state level, and there is some federal conversation about management. And there is some conversation about treaties, right? So one, because some sharks are already terribly endangered. And so that intersects with some other treaties. And people understand how devastating the shark finning practice has been to populations of sharks. Sharks, of course, are also caught up as bycatch, and they're devastated for all kinds of other uses. They're used in research. So the shark populations are declining alarmingly quickly, and people are beginning to understand that. Both the people who want to continue to use them and want there to be enough of them for that, but also people who are recognizing that as something like an apex predator in the habitat of the oceans. Losing these animals is devastating, not just to the sharks, but to the other populations, the other species in the oceans. So there is some progress. How quickly we can make progress, I won't speak to. I just don't know. And whether we'll be able to save some of the most imperiled species. I'm hopeful. I actually am, because there are a lot of people really focused on sharks right now. And that's very, very helpful. And that's even despite the bad rap, right? That sharks get, the bad reputation, how people get so scared with our movies and literature and all kinds of other things that sort of demonize them. So we're overcoming some of that. That's still happening. And I think that's something that we all can do, right? Is to speak out when people talk about sharks incorrectly and say how scary they are, how they sort of seek out, right? Their goal is to eat human beings. It's not their goal. So we can counter some of that disinformation, which will help. And that'll make it a little bit easier for all these other legislative, cultural, educational kinds of campaigns to be successful.
Absolutely agree. Thank you. We have a question from Ultimosh. Wonderful presentation. My question is regarding what standard you are using to define sentience. Is that a species feels pain generally, it has a nervous system, or is it some sort of other standard? What is the general US standards or factors on defining sentience, and is this different from a world standard?
That's a fabulous question. So there isn't one standard, as the question sort of acknowledges. And this is an important area where the law and science need to talk more fluidly to one another. In the US, there is no legal definition for animal sentience. And so in some respects, that's good, because we can use the scientific studies that we have available to us to indicate sentience, regardless of whether they're nervous system based or different. And so in the aquatic animal space, and for folks who don't know, scientists used to say basically any animal who doesn't have a nervous system that replicates or duplicates or looks quite a lot like the human system is likely not to experience pain at all, right? And then they said, well, maybe they could, but it wouldn't be like we experience pain. So both the physical experience of pain and sort of the psychological experience of pain. And if it's not the same as ours, we don't have to pay attention to. Those are falling by the wayside, I'm pleased to say. And so fish in particular, and we have so many different species of fish, right? Again, not just fin fishes, but so many animals that operate in the world, in the biological, physical world differently than we do. It doesn't make any sense that biological beings wouldn't have the ability to protect themselves from harmful stimuli, right? It just doesn't make sense. They would just die. And so scientists are beginning to understand how the perception of pain and perception itself of biological external stimuli operate amongst really different species. And so there's lots of really wonderful literature in the scientific field about how that operates for fin fishes, how it operates for cephalopods, say octopus, right? And even looking at mollusks and some of these other animals. And so there was over 300 scientific studies that were surveyed by the London School of Economics group on their sentience group, that then it wrote a report and advised the UK Parliament saying we have enough data, right? Scientific data. And that's hard to come by, to say there's a consensus within the scientific field to say that these animals are sentient, experience pain. And so sometimes each of those studies are going to handle the question really differently. Right. So some will say it's sufficiently equivalent to the human system. Some will say it's different, but it's good enough. Right. And some people approach the conversation a little bit differently. So there isn't, even within the scientific community, a single definition or set of guidelines for establishing sentience. So you have to talk about what are they testing, which animals are they testing, and what is each sort of researcher's guideline, right, for determining sentience. Having put all of that to the side for a second, then we say, what do we do with that information and how does the law make sense of that? So even if the scientists are talking sort of in different ways about this conversation, how does the law deal with that? And for us, I think we actually have a simple task, which is to say, it's not for us to decide, right? If the scientists have decided these animals are sentient, that's really all we need to know. As long as it's a valid study, peer-reviewed, validated, all of that, as long as it's strong science, if they're telling us these animals are sentient and can feel pain, and whatever that means, right? They feel negative stimuli. People, again, will use different words to describe what they mean by sentience. But if we have some awareness, right? And some harm, right? Some sense of harm that we can then talk about avoiding, that's, I think, where the law comes in. So I hope that's helpful. We could talk about this conversation for a really long time. And I do want to, again, emphasize that even for the animals for which we don't have proof of sentience, that's probably, generally because there isn't enough science done yet. And so I want to call out and recognize that doing these studies causes harm to these animals, right? And so that's problematic. And yet without it, we can't get this proof that we need to rely on within the legal context. And it shouldn't be just because we don't have the positive proof of sentience that we're not talking about protecting these or any other animals.
Great, thank you. So we have quite a few questions about aquaculture, which you mentioned in your presentation. For those who don't know, is the farming of aquatic species. So I'm going to try and combine some of them into one because they're all kind of similar. The first is from Brian, which is whether factory farms for farmed raised fish are largely unregulated. How do these entities compare or differ from what we typically understand our approach to CAFOs is for terrestrial animals, such as cows, pigs, and chickens, etc.? And then the question from Ken is, with the increase in aquaculture, how do these considerations apply to cultivated shellfish, and how should they be separated out in aquatic animal law reform? And he used the example of mussels.
Great. Yeah, good questions. And apologies for using the term aquaculture without defining it. We've gotten used to using it, and so I sometimes forget. So aquaculture is the practice of producing seafood, if you will, not just taking them from the seas or oceans or rivers in the ways that we traditionally have done. So we're creating literally factories on land. We're creating open net pens in oceans. We're creating raceways. We're creating tubes and rafts and all kinds of different systems, depending on the species that we are farming for. And I should also say, we're farming these animals for human food use and we're also farming them for use for other animals. So one of the big distinctions between farming aquatic animals and farming terrestrial animals is that many of the aquatic animals are carnivorous. So one, we don't have a history of farming those animals in the same way we do with terrestrial animals. And so we're taking animals from the ocean or farming them in order to feed the animals we're farming, right? So we have to get the smaller fish from someplace to feed to the larger fish that we want to then feed to human beings. And so whereas in the terrestrial context, we're usually taking crops, right, to feed to the animals, to feed to the humans. So it's a very, very inefficient and much more significantly cruel undertaking because we're killing so many more hundreds and thousands of millions of animals all the time. So that's one big distinction. Another big distinction is that sort of waterways are already less regulated than land in many respects. And certainly anything that happens within sort of a factory farm setting, as we know, there's very, very little regulation. So this is the same for these kinds of factory farms for aquatic animals and more so, right? Just because they're newer, because there's less affirmative regulation around these operations. And so many of us are working to do just that, to create some kind of regulatory framework where we can have conversations about what's appropriate, about the environmental waste, about the consumer problems with, animals that may have toxins in them, antibiotics in them, pesticides in them, all kinds of things, about worker safety, about just all kinds of things. And we're not having those conversations right now because it's not in the regulatory framework. So basically take everything that you know about factory farming of terrestrial animals and ramp it up, right? So we have less regulation, less protection for the animals, for the workers, for the consumers, for the environment. And we have far, far less protection for the animals themselves because we don't have any slaughter regulations, right? So we can kill these animals any way that we want to, and we do. And it's sometimes these animals suffer for hours. So when you think about mollusks, right, to that question, the farming of them is quite different than the farming of say, salmon. And so we need to be thinking very, very carefully about those processes from breeding, transportation, raising, right? All of that from sort of the rearing of the hatchling sometimes, all the way through to the slaughter phase. And we're not doing a very good job of any of that right now. But we can use the work that we've done in the terrestrial factory farming context as a template. Right. So we know the stages, the life stages, we know the transportation and sort of commerce stages. So we know where we need to be looking to add regulation and to have these animals added to those conversations. But we are doing a very, very poor job. I will say, the United States isn't the largest producer of factory farmed seafood right now. Places like Chile and Norway are ahead of the US. And I will say ahead of us in regulations as well. So there's been a lot more conversation. There's been a lot more positive movement about regulating not just environmental issues, but even talking about the welfare of the animals in these systems. And so that's really good. There are some third-party certification constructs that are coming. But we also have Asia, China in particular is also a huge producer. And we don't have as many conversations as far along in some of the Asian countries as we do in Chile and Norway. And the EU is beginning to kind of catch up too. So.
Great, thank you. And that actually leads fabulously into a question that we have from Katie. So we obviously have recognized that there's problems in the context of the regulation, but can you talk a little bit more about how we can make progress protecting farmed aquatic animals, given the lackluster farm animal protection laws that we have in the US?
Yeah, so many of us are working on exactly that, both within the US and across the globe right now. So the first thing is to have people talk about it. That's really, really important because a lot of folks, as many of you know, people still don't know what's going on in terrestrial factory farms and don't know that they exist, which is stunning to many people. But there's a lack of understanding, a lack of information. There's a dreadful lack of information about aquaculture. Even folks who are in the fishing industry, or even folks who are, lots of people who you would think might know don't actually know about what's going on and what the problems are. So talking about it, learning about it, just having general conversations is one thing. Second thing, always just adding the aquatic animals to each conversation. When we're talking about factory farming, people default to thinking we're talking about terrestrial animals because that's what we have been talking about and that's what we've known and worked on. So in that space, we need to say, are we talking about just terrestrial for this conversation, which is fine if that's what the conversation is about. But if we're talking about factory farmed animals generally, let's also then make space to talk about these aquatic animals and think about however that fits into the conversation. So raising them up and including them in those conversations. So those are two general things. Specific things. So one thing that's really easy, we can suggest that people not eat them and not increase the demand for these aquaculture facilities and for the industry to grow. This is the single largest growth industry in the sort of animal food space, both for animal feed, for human feed, and even for industrial uses. And so we have to think really carefully about how governments and venture capital are actually investing. They want more aquaculture for a number of reasons. They're saying, which is not true, but they're saying this is the best way to get food security issues dealt with and poverty alleviation and nutrition, right, to the global populations when we know some of the other problems that we're seeing with, we can't do it with terrestrial farmed animals. We just don't, as the population is going to increase, we don't have enough land mass. So how do we do it? People are saying this is the solution. So rather than saying this is the solution, I would rather in those conversations, people say it's cheaper, easier, and better for all involved if we go to alternatives, right? And so there are wonderful alternatives already existing and coming in the pipeline for all kinds of seafood options, right? And so that was problematic a while ago, but now we have plant-based ones, we have cellular-based ones coming online, fermentation-based. So there's amazing, amazing things happening in the food space. So we want to support that and make sure that we alleviate as many legal barriers to their success as possible, whether that's labeling laws or any other kinds of regulatory. They need to be regulated. That's totally fine, but not in a way to make it less competitive, right, with the other kinds of products that are out there. So I think those are some of the things that we can do. So I hope that's responsive to the question. I could kind of go on and on with lots of specific things that we might be able to do, but it's probably better to stay at the general level for right now, if that seems responsive fully to the question.
I think that's great. And I think that since we're on the topic of kind of law reform and using the law as a tool, we have a question here. Can you speak on some positive international legal models that exist for the protection of aquatic animals that could potentially be mirrored in the US?
That's a great question. So there's some very good ones. I'll pick my current favorite right now is something called the Central Arctic Oceans Fisheries Agreement. And the reason I like this is because it does a number of the things that I've been saying and others have been saying for a long time that we should do with laws, but we don't do. So it uses the precautionary principle and says, you know what, we are worried about overfishing sort of in general, but certainly in this area, which hasn't seen industrial fishing. And so we're going to ban it for a period of time so that we can study and figure out what that might look like and what the problems might be before we just let people go ahead and do it. So they're using the precautionary principle. They mandate the use of science in their decision-making, and they mandate Indigenous voices in their decision-making and making space for them at the table for these conversations. It's a tremendous, I think, framework and model for how we should design some of our laws and the kinds of things we should be taking into account, the people who are participating. I think 16 countries have signed on to this, including the US, which is also very unusual. We often don't, and Russia and lots of other important countries. So I think that one's a very, very good model. If we could do some of that within the aquaculture space, that would be phenomenal. Like, just hold on, let's study this, let's figure out what kind of long-term harm we're going to do. One of the things that people don't understand is some of the breeding cycles for some of these aquatic animals are so long. And so when you take just, millions of these animals, they can't reproduce in ways to sustain their populations. And because of the migratory nature of these animals, right, the impacts they have are really wide. So just as an example, here in the Pacific Northwest, salmon have been overfished, and we now kill sea lions who are trying to eat salmon, which is their natural food, because we want to save enough for humans to eat. And yet there isn't enough in the water, both for the sea lions, but for orcas. And so one of the reasons people are postulating, there's many reasons that the orcas in the Pacific Northwest are suffering: pollution, microplastics, ship strikes, all kinds of stressors, but that there literally isn't enough food. And when we think about this, a salmon could have, back, say 100 years ago, one salmon might be 100 pounds, right? Because they're long-lived animals, they grow really big. So an orca could eat 2 or 3 salmon in a day and be fine. But now, typically, salmon might be, say, 12 pounds, maybe, right? And so the orca need to eat a lot of these animals, and we're just taking them so quickly that they can't grow fast enough. There aren't enough of them for the orcas. And it's not just orcas, it's bears, right? It's wolves, it's caribou, moose, like all kinds of other animals, both on land and in the water, rely on these animals. And so thinking about, you just pull one species, salmon, out of its natural sort of cycle, and the impact is devastating and far ranging. We're talking about the entire Pacific Ocean, right? It's just incredible to think about. So anything we can do to prevent those long-term harms that we're going to need to fix, I think is a really good model.
Fantastic. So we actually have a question that speaks directly to that from Catherine, with the mass manatee mortality event continuing in Florida. Obviously, we know manatees are one of the very charismatic animals. Has your research at all come across legal avenues for addressing pollution, such as herbicides or sewage, that directly harms listed species under the Endangered Species Act by wiping out their food sources and or habitats?
So this is a great question, and it kind of goes back to some things we were talking about earlier. I think just as a model, one good thing that we can begin to look at here in the United States, there was a lot of industrial pollution created in the Midwestern part of the country that migrated to the northeastern part of the country in terms of what we used to call acid rain. The northeastern, hopefully I said that right, to the northeastern part of the country, those states banded together to sue, right, some of the Midwestern states and say, you're basically creating a problem that we can't regulate because we don't have jurisdiction in your state, but it's affecting us. And so we actually have to have a say in stopping this from migrating to us. I think that's a model for looking at the runoff, right? Because there's a lot of agriculture runoff that goes into the oceans. There's a lot of industrial runoff. There's a lot of even just stormwater, municipal runoff, right? That goes into these water systems and migrates a very, very long way. So sometimes stuff all the way down the Mississippi River, if we're talking about the west side of Florida, and certainly on the east side of Florida, we have the entire East Coast to worry about. We have a lot of agricultural runoff, in particular that deadens the water, right? Sucks the oxygen out of the water, makes it hard. Again, and this is an example, it makes it hard for the seagrasses to grow, right? The things that the manatee live on. So even if we looked at it from a NEPA perspective and said, well, they're not this, agricultural runoff isn't killing the manatee directly, right? It's certainly making them more susceptible to disease. It's reducing their immune systems. It's making it harder for them, but it's killing their food, and that's killing them. And so we need to be looking at these things from a systems approach. And so I do think we can look at that sort of New England example. I think we can begin looking at and saying we need to do NEPA analyses for anything that goes into the water, right? We just have this default that agriculture runoff is sort of natural. Well, it's not. So first of all, it's way too concentrated. We're dumping way too much of it into our systems, and our natural systems can't handle it. So back in the day, they might have been able to, but not anymore. Plus, we're not just talking about simple manure, right? We're talking about, again, pesticides, antibiotics, all kinds of chemicals and other toxins that are going in at all these different points, right? And then accumulating, collecting together. And that's on top of, like I said, municipal things like the stuff people flush their medicines, right? All kinds of things are going into the water systems, and we're not looking at this holistically and saying, we really need to stop. We're just basically saying you can put this much pollution in this person, right? And then this person can put this much pollution in this person. And we're not doing this collective analysis that we really, really need to do. I think the manatee example is a good one because people do care about these animals from a number of perspectives. One, they're adorable, people like them, but two, they're a tourist attraction. And so they have an economic value to the state of Florida. And obviously they have a huge impact on their environment. So they're important species for the habitat. So if we look at it from any one of those angles, we should have significant incentive to stop them from dying off completely. Again, these are slow reproducing animals. They're really large animals. They're really important in so many ways. So if we can step back and say, let's look at all of the inputs that are making it harder for them to survive, and let's at least tackle a few of them, right? Maybe we can't do all of them, but a few of them. And so using laws and saying, they're going to be endangered. So let's use the Endangered Species Act. Let's use NEPA. Let's use the Clean Water Act. Let's use every tool we possibly have. And the other thing I should say is, when people ask me for advice about best ways to go, I never think there's a best way, right? Let's try a whole bunch of things. Let's have different organizations trying different things, and collectively, right? Even if we're not working together directly, that will make it a lot easier. It'll make the legal environment more likely for any of those one things to be successful. And that's, I think, a really good thing to keep in mind. Also, it keeps us from being overwhelmed, right? Because the stuff I'm saying is really huge. So if you can just pick a piece of it and start there, please do.
Great. And you spoke a little bit in your answer about some of the jurisdictional issues as among and between the states, and then, of course, at a federal level. So we have a question here from Rajashri, which is absolutely appreciated the brief and succinct explanation on aquatic animal laws. I am watching from Southeast Asia. It's always troubled me to find out about dugongs, a type of mammal kept caged underwater for tourism by the unscrupulous. I always thought that they could get away with it because they are out of reach of terrestrial laws or domestic laws if they are in international waters. What could be effective to curtail these practices and make them accountable?
It's a great question. So the lack of regulation in international waters is a significant problem, and one we need to address very, very seriously. So we can do that in part by bringing these issues to the international bodies. So we can bring it to the CITES Convention and to the UN Environmental Program. We can begin to to raise these questions more loudly, more regularly, and to help people understand that, again, they may be in international waters now, but if they're traveling into a country's jurisdictional waters, right, then they have an interest. And so I think there are a lot of ways we can say we have an interest enough that we should begin to talk about some kinds of regulation. Enforcement in international law, generally in international waters, very, very problematic. I'm sure folks know, I won't go into that right now, but putting that to the side, because we have enforcement problems with all of our laws. Thinking about the dugong, and so thinking about changing the default that we can take these animals and make them our property, right? And so that's the default right now. If there's no law against it, we get to do it. And so we need to create a framework that says these animals belong to themselves, to their species, to their habitats, and we can't interfere with that without good reason and without understanding the harm that we're causing, and begin to have those conversations, right? And then hopefully on the other side, we can also say, why is this entertainment? Why is this seen as a good thing? If you value these animals, and that's the drive to want to get close to them, to see them, to swim with them, then understand the value they have to themselves is counter to us treating them this way, right? So if we love animals, it's just like the question about zoos, right? And so it's wonderful to have contact and to be close to these animals. But if we're doing it because we love them or because we care about them, we have to tap down that instinct and say, but our desire to be close to them is hurting them, right? And it's not hurting just this animal, but what about this animal's family? What about this animal's community? Have we taken so many, we've destroyed an entire pod, or, you know what I mean? So we need to enlarge those conversations sort of on the user end and then on the regulation end too, because the regulation end is going to take a long time. I would also suggest that we look for, again, anything that connects, right? Is taking them out of their home, affecting fisheries generally, right? Is it affecting other species who are already deemed endangered? Is it affecting any laws that we already have? Is there any tie that we can make to a law that already exists where we can make a complaint, even in the international bodies, right? We have the UN Environmental Program for the first time ever, right? It just recently in Kenya, in their meeting said we need to figure out how to take into account or take account of maybe animal welfare, because it affects environmental welfare, which affects human welfare. And so this One Health concept is something the UN has now actually officially recognized. And so we can build on that, I think, and take it further.
Great, thank you. And you touched a little bit in your answer on animals used in entertainment or for sport. So I want to focus a little bit on that. And we have a question here from Cherie, who said, this week I read an email article by National Geographic, which states that over 60,000 animals, both land and aquatic, are killed annually in the US in animal contests. What can be done to fight this situation in both the legal realm as well as the cultural acceptance of animal contests which sanction killing animals for sport?
Yeah, so this is a long conversation, and it's one I don't think the animal movement has engaged with for quite a while. So there was a significant anti-hunting element of the community and work that was being done in the US and in the UK in particular. Countries have traditions, and this is important for aquatic animals and for hunting, right? So people used to hunt and fish, right? It's sort of how we think of human beings as having survived, even if it's not completely true, right? We have these agrarian folks who have survived other ways for millennia. Putting that to the side, so we want to, when we're thinking about regulations, societies tend to want to protect those things that are traditional. And so traditional hunting and fishing is seen as something, well, of course we've done it. It's never been wrong. How can we say that it's wrong? So I think we need to begin to disentangle those activities when they're used for, it's not really done anywhere for sustainable use anymore. It's done, so it isn't that people don't eat them, but it's usually the people who hunt and fish aren't doing it. If they won't die if they don't do it, right? They're selling these animals on and they're part of a larger industry. So we don't typically have sustainable hunting and fishing in those terms. So we can say we understand that people need to eat, right? So putting all of that to the side for the moment, let's separate out the sport, right? Why are we killing animals for sport. And here in the US, if you look at deer hunting, and this is something I've studied a lot and done a lot of work on, we actually plant feed corn in like forests and preserves and wildlife refuges so that there'll be more deer, so that they can sell more deer permits. It's a very, very large business. And then say, oh, there's a lot of deer, we have to kill more deer, right? And making sure there's enough deer. And we're killing, the bucks, the male deer, which doesn't affect the carrying capacity of the herd, right? So there's all kinds of things that we're doing that is disingenuous. And so we can call some of that out and say, no, really, this is not about sustainable populations. This is not about eating. This is not about any of those things. This is about entertainment and sport. And it's cruel. And we can and should regulate that, right? That is an unnecessary harm and suffering that should fit under cruelty laws. So that's one of the arguments that I have made and would like to make, right? If you still want to hunt, you can do actual video hunting. You can go into the fields with a video camera thing on the sight of your gun, and it would laser target an animal. And so you could decide if you wanted that kind of thrill. You could still get it without killing the animal. I'm not saying it wouldn't harm the animals, but it wouldn't kill the animal. So there are alternatives if people want to get that fix, that thrill, that doesn't require killing those animals. And I think we should lift up these killing contests, right? There's coyote killing contests, there's badger, there's all kinds. Sometimes we're killing pest animals. I would say way more than 60,000 animals are killed. We have fishing contests, right? So many animals are killed for sport and glory. And I think we just need to say it's time, right? It's time as civilized society, we stop that. We just don't need to do it. We're causing harm. It's inappropriate and we need to stop. And I think we need to develop a sort of coordinated campaign to stop that.
Thank you so much. So we've only got a couple minutes left, and there's two questions. Well, there's a lot more than two questions, but there are two questions here which both kind of speak to different avenues for advocacy and how we can potentially get better regulation for aquatic species. So I'm going to combine them. The first one is from Jose, who said, how sensitive are governments to implementing educational programs in early schools approaching the issue of welfare, both animals and humans? That would be a huge advance in the way we see animals. So he'd like to get your thoughts on that. And then the second one is from Jessie, which says, as you mentioned in your presentation, fish and aquatic life are often forgotten because they aren't visible in the same way that terrestrial animals are. We Animals Media recently shared their photos from investigations in Thailand and Indonesia about how fish are sold, killed, etc. Would be curious for your thoughts as to how such photos and investigations can be used for advocacy in the US in support of stronger laws for protecting aquatic life.
Great. Okay, so the first question about education. Each country is different. In the US, the last I looked, and it's been a couple of years since I've looked, we had about 24 states in the US that required either humane education or certain kinds of education into which we could put animal welfare issues. Sometimes it's environmental, sometimes it's written differently in each state. Most of those don't have any real enforcement, but those are opportunities to talk about animal welfare with the state education boards and with local schools and communities. I will say, even when I was doing this work before the pandemic, teachers are under-resourced, underpaid, overworked, and overwhelmed by all the kinds of things people say. You have to teach the kids this and you have to teach the kids that. So it is a challenge, but trying to find ways to help them and to help it actually relieve some of their work and burdens would be a really good challenge. There are a couple of organizations, Heart and a couple of others, that focus entirely on humane education and implementing them in the schools. In South Africa, there's a great organization. So this is something people are aware of. They need support and help. So if you're interested in this, I would suggest reaching out to those organizations and seeing how you can help in your communities. If you have kids, talk to your teachers, right? Starting locally and starting easily is usually a more successful way to begin. But there's a lot of work that we can do about within the education systems, both with the laws we have, and then obviously we can create some additional laws. We can try and get those mandates spread across all the states in the US and in other countries as well. And again, just having conversations about what we should be teaching kids is a really good conversation to have. And then speaking to the next question, so lifting these animals up and thinking about sort of how we portray them. So I'll say one thing really quickly. There's a great conversation that's been happening now about sort of the social psychology of imagery and what is effective and so thinking about what are our goals And then how do we both talk about the animal suffering and how do we show it? So depending on what our goals are, social psychology will tell us there are different strategies that might be more or less useful or successful. And so thinking about, graphic imagery, for instance, sometimes, makes people recoil. It makes people get defensive and kind of hardened in their positions. And sometimes it doesn't. It depends on what the message is. It depends on the audience. It depends on a lot of things. The good news is there are a lot of people studying that right now. So we have We Animals and we have Synergia in Italy, and we have all, people doing undercover investigations. And I'll say really important, right? It's important for that information to come out. So it took a long time for us to have undercover investigations and information coming out of terrestrial factory farms to help people know what's going on and believe that it was true. It's taken years and years, and we're still not fully there. So we need to be doing a lot more of that in the aquaculture context so that people see and understand what's happening to these animals. And then a question about how we share that information both with consumers, with the public generally, and with regulators and legislators are separate conversations, each of those. But it's phenomenal that people are doing this work. We need to support them again in their work because it's really traumatizing. It's difficult work. And I'll just add too that sort of along this idea of how we see these animals, how we don't see them, and how we lift them up, I just want to sort of mention the situation in Ukraine, right? So it's another example when there are emergencies and crises around the world, whether it's floods or wildfires. It's good to be thinking, obviously, about all the needs of the people. And then we begin to think about companion animals. And sometimes we're now beginning to think about the farmed animals, like what happens to livestock, say in a wildfire situation. We're still not thinking about the animals in laboratories as much as we should. And we're really still missing almost all the aquatic animals, right? So from the flame retardants we're putting onto these fires that go into the waterways to just, the dozens of millions who are killed. And so thinking again about animals, obviously our hearts go out to all of the people in Ukraine who are suffering and to their companion animals and to the farmed animals. And again, I haven't seen a single mention about aquatic animals for Ukraine. Understandably, I do understand that, but for the people whose focus is and are the animals, it's up to us, I think, to be thinking about how we can help, right? How we can protect those animals sort of both before and after. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. Unfortunately, we are out of time. You've left us with a lot to think about. I want to say a special thank you to everyone for joining us today. And of course, a very special thank you to Kathy for sharing your wonderful insights. We did have a lot of great questions, which unfortunately we were not able to get to all of them. If we didn't get to your question, we'll do our best to follow up with you via email. So thanks so much again to Kathy and to all of you for joining us today. I really hope that you enjoy the rest of the symposium. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, ALDF. And thanks to all the attendees.